Like many humanities professors, I'm on the lookout for authors who are keen observers of some of the more absurd aspects of contemporary American life and who are not afraid to explore the boundaries where real-life experience transitions into sort of a magical realism. This gets AM into a bit of trouble. She says in one interview, "In America, people get confused and sort of pissed off with me because I think they feel like they're being criticized. And I think from other countries with a little bit of distance, it's a clearer view." Days of Awe, the third short story collection in Holmes' catalog, is a furious insight into the phobias, absurdities, and realities probably common to us all. An insight that is perhaps even more relevant now given our current cultural situation. This book is strikingly good, and it's terrifying. But it's the terrible, A.M. suggests, that we must see face to face. A.M. Holmes grew up in Washington, D.C., the adopted daughter of an artist's father and a mother who worked as a school guidance counselor. And she has a book about that, a memoir. Holmes has won the Women's Prize for her book, May We Be Forgiven, and writes frequently on arts and culture for Vanity Fair. Maureen Corrigan, who will be speaking with AM today, is a book critic for NPR's Fresh Air. I bet you have heard her on the radio. AM says she listens to her every single morning on her way to Princeton to teach. And is the Nikki and Jamie Grant Distinguished Professor of the Practice in Literary Criticism at the other Catholic university, Georgetown University. She's an associate editor of and contributor to Mystery and Suspense Writers, and the winner of the 1999 Edgar Award for Criticism, presented by the Mystery Writers of America. I give you Maureen Corrigan and A.M. Holmes.
I just want to say thank you so much before we even jump in, because it's one of those weird things where I really am a fan. I was like, oh my God, I have to talk to her. But thank you, because
well, as you know, I'm a fan of your work. I hope you know that.
I do.
And in preparation for our conversation, I was looking back on some of my old reviews, which is always a mixed experience. I noticed that what I said about you is what a lot of people say about your work. I said, I'd follow you anywhere because you're so smart, it's scary. And people...
You can talk to my mom, who's just right there. Direct it just that way.
But people talk about how smart you are, and even in this book, I was looking at the blurbs, we've got sharp-edged, we've got terrifying, those kinds of adjectives, because, I know, speaking as a reader, you take me places where I sometimes don't want to go, and I didn't even know existed. So, and this collection certainly does that. I wanted to ask you how you put it together, because these are short stories that take place in a Walmart type store. Right. They take place at a conference about genocide. They take place in LA, of course. Right. They span the spectrum. One of the last stories in this collection even has a footnote that talks about the Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin, who was an archaeologist, and Peking Man, the bones that he discovered. And I'm reading this footnote saying, how is she going to make this into a story? And you do, and it's transcendent, and it lifts me up. How do you put it together?
Well, I love philosophy is one of the things, and I love thinking, and I like... my reading tends towards nonfiction. So part of it is I consume a lot of fact, of detail, of kind of reading a culture and reading politics and history and all that stuff. And then a lot of these stories actually were written for various artists. So then there's a whole other element where I actually sit down with the artist and I say, why did you make what you made? What did you feed on to make it? What does it mean to you? And then I think about what it means to me, because a long time ago I used to study art history and write art criticism. So I'm trying to weave all of those things together, and it took 12 years to do. I mean, it's not, I think you can tell the relative, almost like the metallic weight of a book. You know what I mean? When you read it, you can say, oh, this was a 1.5-year book, and this is there's a density to it, which I think is just that longer time cooking.
I'm a little hazy about the connection with the artist.
Sure.
I'm not a visual person, so
sure.
If I were, would I be able to pick up whose story is aligned? You thank the artist at the back of the book. Whose story is aligned with which artist?
You know, the fact that you even just said the whose story. So one of the stories, I think it's like the third or fourth in there, I was going to look, but it's called Whose Story Is It, and Why Is It Always on Her Mind? And it's one I love, and it's about sort of the multi-generational trauma. And there's several of the stories in the book really deal with kind of the fallout of war, mostly Second World War, over time. But that story is about a girl who's sort of replicating her mother and grandmother's experience in some way. And that was written for an English artist named Sarah Jones. And what I knew about Sarah Jones before I met her and talked to her was there were three bodies of work. One was photographs of roses in England, which play prominently in the story. The other was of young girls almost always hiding under furniture, which I thought was interesting, and a lot about sort of that awkward shyness and how to be oneself and what is your identity. And then the third body of work was she went and photographed analyst couches in New York City, just the couches. So those three, that's an odd, and when you read the story, you'll say, oh, that makes perfect sense now. But the idea of how you would weave those three things into a piece of fiction, that's the fun of it. I mean, you know, yeah.
They also, a lot of the stories have this kind of, I keep thinking of surrealist, mundane quality to them. I mean, we were talking in the green room back there about a course that you dropped out of at Georgetown in the summer. So I'm spilling private conversation here, but writers like Pynchon, writers who were kind of on the edge at that time.
Yeah.
And I was so surprised that you said you were.
They terrified me.
They terrified you. Yeah.
It's interesting because I think people think of me as somebody who writes really scary things, but I'm also somebody who, I hate scary movies. I didn't used to like cartoons at all. I was very like literal. I'm like, don't want any animation bothering me, except Scooby-Doo, who I liked a lot. Ruh-roh. And I think that even notions of kind of the magical and the surreal were fairly uncomfortable for me until probably it was getting to someone like Angela Carter, who I as a teacher, who was incredible and really blended political, philosophical, social, and magical into these sort of really crazy stories. And then Marquez a little bit. And actually, I think of John Cheever really as a surrealist that isn't often acknowledged. But yeah, who else swims across Westchester County except a surrealist? So there's a weave there. But it is interesting because I think I'm always surprised at how frightened people are by the stories. And I'm like, what? You know?
In some of the stories, like the one I mentioned, Omega Point, where we've got Teilhard de Chardin and it's kind of blending of times and everything. There you've got this surrealist sort of plot, but in the opening story, which takes place in L.A., it's almost like, well, this whole place is surreal. Like, no, sorry, not the opening story, but many of the L.A. stories. In the opening one, a man is injecting himself with Botox or something in preparation for going out on the beach. Like, are we doing this? Like, it's almost like you're saying everyday life has these elements.
Well, I think everyday life is kind of absurd. And I think more and more we see and overhear, and even now on our news, there are these things you go, really? Like, nothing makes a lot of sense. So I think part of what I'm trying to do is order it a little bit and make some sense of it. But even the other night, I was walking home from a reading I was giving, and this may sound like too gruff. There was a homeless, legless woman in a wheelchair pushing herself along with a really expensive pair of Beats on her ears, talking to somebody maybe on another planet for all I know. And I could tell she was in conversation because the Beats were glowing, the little beat part. And I thought, hey, where did you get those Beats? And who are you talking to? And she's just sailing along the streets of New York City. I thought, that would be in one of my stories. And it would also be in the work of, do you know Carol Churchill, the playwright? So I love her work. And she also sort of is playing with those ideas and the things that are hanging off the edges, I would say. And I think in some ways right now we're probably all hanging off the edge a little bit, more than we were, 10 years ago. Yeah.
You mentioned whose story is it and what. I love the title, so I don't want to
just call it Whose Story Is It?
Whose story is it?
Exactly.
Why do I keep telling it or thinking?
Yeah.
Another story about trauma is the title story, Days of Awe, which is really blew me away. And first of all, I loved it because it takes place at a convention on genocide, a conference on genocide, and it kind of has that sort of academic satire layer to it, where you have fun with conference titles and
Right.
people's bad behavior, academics especially bad behavior at conferences, and who can resist that Lucky Jim type
Right,
element, right?
absolutely.
But there's also it becomes a story of ideas, which I think is, and it raises a question that I think you have considered elsewhere. Like, do I have the right to tell this story?
Sure.
Do I have the right to write this fiction when I
Right.
haven't lived this?
Right. So that's, I mean, in the story, it's funny. It does have the sort of an academic overlay a little bit. And I used to love reading the MLA catalog, the Modern Language Association, because really it'll be like the sneaker in literature, from Tupac to tomorrow. Or I mean, it'll literally be some crazy thing, and it'll be like, what price is too high to pay? I mean, and then it'll be like a whole symposium on like Tupac Shakur's sneakers as seen in the short stories of the following, whatever. I mean, it's crazy, but it's kind of amazing. And in terms of the notion of who's allowed to tell certain stories, I mean, I think that's on the one hand always been with us, and then the ways in which it comes to the kind of cultural forefront, it moves back and forth. But there definitely right now is a sense, well, if you didn't live that story, it's not yours to tell. And I think that's a really philosophical and cultural big problem, because I think the other piece of it is we seem to be having a very hard time understanding each other's experience and understanding, you know, we're busy saying how we're different rather than talking about how we're alike, or how human behavior and human emotion really isn't gendered and it doesn't have a race or a class to it. They're very fundamental human qualities. So who owns the right to tell those stories? So I am talking about that and pushing at it a little bit, because I think it's important. And there was a thing that came out after I finished the story in the last few weeks, where they're talking about the number of young people who don't know what the Holocaust was, don't know when it happened or how many people died. And that also brings up another idea, which is that if we only rely on survivors to tell a story, then soon we're going to be running out, because those survivors are very old. And I think it's not just the Holocaust per se, but it is our history. And if we don't learn our history, and that's on the smallest scale, within a family, within a town, within a government, or globally, then we have huge problems, because it tends to bring on really bad behavior.
I feel like I want a whole other night with you on this topic.
Well,
it is the topic. Do you
Right.
get into this with your students at Princeton?
Well, last year and this year, I taught a course in writing political fiction, which was, they never had a course like that. And it was super interesting to me, because you get, the thing I like about teaching at Princeton is it's not a school where people are going because they want to grow up and be writers. They want to be mathematicians, they want to be scientists, they want to be president. So I'm like, come, take my class, and we're going to work on that. Because I keep thinking, no, it's a really big idea, but this generation, especially, their future and their jobs and what they're going to be doing 10 years from now doesn't exist. So if you can't imagine and conceptualize something, you can't do it. And yet they're highly academic, they worked incredibly hard to take tests to get there, and they have no imagination whatsoever. So I sit there in my class, and if you know what I write, I sit there and I'm like, we're going to make stuff up, and they're like, ooh, And I'm like, no, really, it'll be okay. And then I'm like, tell me something. And they're like, I woke up today. And I'm like, no, well, let's try again. But it's that. So in writing political fiction, it drew kids from a whole other part of the university. And the question is even what's political, and it's tiny or big. It can be about a campaign, it can be about something in your family. But it was amazing to see what they wanted to write about and how they wanted to find language and a way of writing about those things. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, yeah, I keep thinking about you teaching at Princeton.
Right. Which is very funny in and of itself. The idea of me teaching at Princeton.
Well, you teach at Princeton, you work in LA,
Yeah.
you work on TV shows, on
do.
movies, you work with Stephen King.
Yeah.
You do that. You work on your own,
I do.
wonderful writing. So how do you do all this?
I have a problem, which is that I apparently don't say no. And so I'm always encouraged that I should, say no more often. I am somebody who, I don't get writer's block because I don't have time to. So if I'm stuck, I just go and do another thing for a little while and then come back, and I think the other thing's sort of working on itself. I probably do too much. I also sit on a lot of boards and do a lot of volunteer work, and because there's a lot to do. But I don't know, I'm alive, So I want to be alive and be in it, and I really love teaching. I love these kids. I love that they're not there because they want to be writers. I'm trying to teach them how to be human, and I think that's the bigger thing. When I love writing, and the thing about writing for TV, it's a whole other world, and it's like what magazine writing used to be. You know, it's super fast. You get paid pretty quickly. And actually, you get health insurance, which nothing else gives you health insurance. I know, so you should come do it too. We should all do it. We can all just probably tonight come up with a show, and maybe we can sell it next week. We could even be called Politics and Prose, if you don't mind. I'm sure it would be fine, you know. Yeah, exactly. Or it could be called lawsuits. No, I mean, anyway. But yeah, and I think there's things now that you can do in those. The question always for me is, how do you talk about ideas? How can you talk about ideas in a TV show? How can you talk about ideas in fiction? How can you teach people to think about ideas and not just about themselves?
And your writing, especially in this collection, I think more so than in your novels that I've read and the nonfiction and the other short story collection, your writing is really dialogue driven in a lot of these stories. And in fact, when one story, it's text driven.
Right.
And I thought, and I'm not going to get forget it.
The National Caged Bird Show.
Thank you.
Exactly. Which is a real thing. There is such a thing as a National Caged Bird Show.
And I started reading and I thought, okay, well, if this were someone else, I'd sort of roll my eyes and think, oh, they're trying out this form. And and I'm completely sucked in. It's also a story that I thought you were maybe consciously doffing a hat to Salinger's great story.
For Esme with Love and Squalor.
Yeah.
I was having a conversation.
Okay, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about how, there's many things that happen in the story, but it takes place in a parakeet chat room for people who love parakeets. Yep. And the two main characters, one is a sort of young girl living, I would say, both a very privileged and a very not good life on the Upper East Side of New York City. So on the one hand, it's privilege. On the other hand, there's a lot missing. And the other main character is a soldier at war in one of the stands, and they come together in a weird way to find comfort in this parakeet chat room that's filled with, I would describe it almost like as a chorus of other people who, as I see them, are overweight and on oxygen in the middle of the country, driving around on ride-em scooters in a Walmart often. But they also come together, and it's also a place where, as much as your other philosophical and political opinions can be different, they've all come together around this idea of the parakeets. And of course, it's not about parakeets. It's also really about how the human cost of war hasn't changed since Salinger wrote for Esme, or since ever, and that worries me. And then I was also looking at what does it mean to be a young girl in this sort of day and time, and the darkness of that.
It's a beautiful story. Since we're on to Salinger, a quick digression.
Sure.
But you teach at Princeton.
I do.
Have you gone in to see An Ocean Full of Bowling Balls, the manuscript?
So this is the craziest thing. So Salinger's, a big chunk of unpublished Salinger is in the Princeton Library, place I go all the time, and I didn't know that until very recently. And then I had this weird other Salinger connection, with some people here might remember. When I was 19, I wrote this play called The Call-In Hour, and I sent it out all over the country, as one does when you're 19 and you have a lot of free time. And it won a playwriting award here at the Source Theater, and it was right after Mark David Chapman shot John Lennon. I was very upset, not just by the John Lennon part, but he pulled Catcher in the Rye out of his pocket, and I thought, that's really gross. And it's a book that meant so much to so many people, and all of a sudden it had this taint on it. And so I wrote this play where a guy is on a subway, and he basically is holding coffee. He says, I met Salinger. He kind of stole my life. I grew up. I went on. You have to get on with your lives. And all these people call it on the radio show. And I bought a copy of Billboard magazine, and I used the real radio stations. And then one girl, in fact, I put one girl at a Baltimore radio station who threatens to kill herself. And this always happens to me when I write something. Like 3 weeks later, some girl goes to that radio station, and I'm like, how does that happen? And it's a longer story, but it's happened. Music for Torching, which ends with a school shooting, came out the day after Columbine, was the pub date. And you're just like, that's so weird. But it's about, I think, reading the culture. But anyway, so then Salinger got wind of this play and tried to sue me. And I was like a toddler. And everyone's like, he wouldn't sue a toddler, would he? And everyone's like, yeah, he would. And then all these various people who knew Salinger were supposedly asking, like, oh, hey, Jerry, like, give a kid a break. And then I thought, I can't do that. I wasn't trying to, like, upset Salinger. So we changed Catcher in the Rye to Life in the Outfield for the production. And I'm still an incredibly shy person, but my parents will test. I couldn't even go to the opening. I drove my parents' Volvo like in circles around Washington, D.C. while my mom and dad and my aunt from Chicago had flown in and whatever. And yeah, I know. 19 is not an easy age, as we all know. Yes.
Yeah, and I think Salinger he's one of those authors who's it's better to read him than to have met him.
Yeah, I think probably. That's sort of been firmed up in recent years. Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I probably dodged a significant problem there.
Well, one of the stories that I think everybody's going to talk about and mention in their reviews and just really want to argue about is a prize for every player, which takes place in Mammoth Mart, kind of Costco, Walmart. Family is going shopping on a shopping trip. And the dad inadvertently, wins the affection of the fellow shoppers and gets nominated for president?
Yeah. And then it's pretty much like a done deal that he's already on the road by the time he leaves, because they print things in the home office section, and they've like news trucks are outside by the time he leaves the store. It's
So
sure.
I wanted to know if you would read some of it.
I will try to. That's so nice. It's just not in the large print, but no, that's okay. I'm going to try to. Okay. So this family does their weekly shopping in the store, and they have an ongoing contest where there's points and all these things you can win. And this is a part sort of fairly far into the story where they found a baby in the store, and the littlest one wants them to buy the baby. There's an issue because it has no barcode, whether or not it's actually for sale or why it's there. But they're going to take it home and see what happens. But anyway, so we're at the part where I think the mother and daughter have gone off for baby supplies, and the father and son and now the baby are in the TV section. In front of the television, Tom is hypnotized, drawn in. He reflexively jiggles the baby in his arms, but his eyes remain fixed on the screens. I remember black and white, he tells Jimmy. I remember remote controls with the big white buttons like teeth and an audible click. I remember rabbit ears and static. I remember Walter Cronkite. He might have been the last man I trusted. I remember listening to baseball on the radio while reading a comic book and eating pistachio nuts dyed red. I remember riding in my parents' car when there were only lap belts and no one wore them. I remember being sent out to play in the morning and be told to come home in time for dinner. I remember trying to get lost. I remember Yogi Bear and Ranger Smith. I remember when a president spoke as though he were addressing the people, and I remember Richard Nixon saying, "I played by the rules of politics as I found them." And I remember Martin Luther King, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." And Robert Kennedy, although I'm not sure that I remember him while he was still alive. A revolution is coming. A revolution is coming whether we will it or not. We can affect its character. We cannot alter its inevitability. The point is, I remember America. I remember when politicians had a vision, a dream for the people of this country, and didn't run their campaign based on a tax rebate if elected, essentially attempting to buy the vote. Are we that gullible that we thought George Bush's $300 rebate would cover it? Think of what that vote cost. Think of your retirement account, your health insurance, your mortgage, your cost of living versus your salary. How much did you lose, and how much did you make? Who is that man talking to? Someone asks. He's speaking to me, another man says. This is my America, Tom says. Hey, buddy, I'm there with you, another person asks. Run for office. You've got my vote, a woman passing by says. Mine too. People begin to come up and shake Tom's free hand. A man grabs a microphone from a karaoke machine and blows in it to be sure it's on. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? The crowd nods. And with White Christmas playing in the background, he announces, "Ladies and gentlemen, shoppers of all kinds, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the next president of the United States." What's your name? The guy whispers to Tom, Tom Sanford. Thank you.
And again, as weird as that is.
Well, exactly. Right. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Oh, exactly. I saw it coming, is all I can tell you. Yeah.
I couldn't decide when I read that story, and and I don't want to put you as the author in the awful position of saying, well, here's what it means. But I couldn't decide whether you were celebrating this or saying, oh my God, look at how thoughtless we are.
Right. Well, that's a good question. That's often the question about what I'm doing. And I consider myself a very American writer, and I think all these themes are very much about America and where we are now. And it's hard to say. I mean, until fairly like right now, I would say I love being an American writer. I think it's a very complicated spot to be in. This story was written for another artist. It was written for a guy named Bill Owens, who some of you may know, who took a wonderful series of black and white photographs in the 70s called Suburbia. They were in California. And there's one of a woman rolling out sod like a new lawn. And there's another that says, former model home for sale, to which my daughter said to me, thinking about models, she's like, what's a model home? I'm like, what does that mean? But so it's very much about a kind of America and a kind of America run amok. And this story, I hate to say this, I think this story is almost about 9 years old, which means I really was thinking a lot about the ways in which our political system has left behind a lot of people. And I think other people apparently were thinking a little bit about that too. So I'm worried. I mean, I'm definitely very worried, and it's not that I'm not making fun of us or exactly celebrating it, but I think I'm talking about how concerned I am.
It's a great story.
Thank you.
I see that anthologized all over the place.
It's funny because the editor wanted me to write it as a novel, and I kept thinking, what would happen if this guy went on the road? And I also realized he's not somebody who knows history, so I pictured him taking like the high school history teacher with him. And what would happen at a certain point when the political establishment started to feel threatened by him, and how they would either try to co-opt him or take him out literally, and what that would be. So it's sort of like a Mr. Smith doesn't get to Washington, but he does get to the checkout counter. Yeah.
Well, since I have you here,
Yes, exactly.
I'd like to talk for a minute
Sure.
about your memoir,
Oh,
Mistress's
okay.
Daughter,
Sure.
because that meant a lot to me. I'm a mother by adoption. I read that memoir, and at times it was hard as an mother by adoption
Right.
to read about your yearning
Right.
and fantasies about
Right.
the birth
Sure.
parents and all of
Right.
that. And it's also so beautiful and complex.
Mom's getting a Kleenex.
Well, I'll sit there
It's
and cry
okay.
with
No,
you.
it's all okay.
But
Yeah.
the undeniable connection
Right.
of blood, but the beauty of the magic of affinity of
Sure.
choice. And now that you're a mother, and I don't know, I'm just curious about if your thinking about this whole topic has changed in any way, given the fact that you've become a mother now,
Right.
but a biological mother
Sure.
to your daughter.
Right.
Has it complicated any of those thoughts about motherhood and adoption? You still have a couple of adoptive
Well,
children.
there's in the Point Omega story, I love that, the girl from China. There's always a lot of things about China in my stories. I think there's so many things to say about that. I would say it's interesting because when that book came out, I did, when you're doing book tours and stuff, I did a bunch of different events for places. And I did one dinner, and all the people at dinner, people chose, different authors' dinners they wanted to go to. And it turned out they were all adoptive parents. And they all wanted to ask me things that they wouldn't ask their children, which was fascinating. And a lot of their children were like in their 40s and 50s. It wasn't like they were little kids who, they were saying, I don't want to bother, But it was fascinating to me the ways in which those parents had questions, had sometimes doubts about what they had done, or what information they'd given or not given, or their child's reactions, or the ways people were growing up. And then at my daughter's school, for a long time, I used to go to the adoption committee meetings, which were mostly, again, adoptive parents and a few adopted people. And it was fascinating to me how fiercely protective of their children these adoptive parents were, and how so desperately and badly they wanted both to protect them, and they wanted them all the things everyone wants. They wanted them to be happy and to feel known and seen, and if they came from another country or a different race, how to broker all those things. I think adoption is honestly, it's an amazing thing, and it's a way for a child to have a home and a people to have a family, and it's not. I think it's amazing. But then when I wanted to have a kid, my mom goes, "What? Adoption's not okay for you?" And I was like, "No, it's perfectly fine for me." And I actually tried after. She's like, I tried after I had my kid to actually adopt. There was one of those stories where a girl went to a hospital and had a baby and left, and a friend who was a doctor called, said, "Someone just had a baby and left. Quick, hurry!" And I went over and I was like, "Oh, I'll take it. I'll take the." And it was fascinating because then I actually had to meet the mother that afternoon. She came back to sign the papers, and I really was like, trying to talk about fast track. I'm just going to adopt this kid like right now. And and it's funny too, because as an adopted person, I don't attach very easily. It takes me a very long to attach. Like, I can't even have goldfish because they're gone before I'm like, I don't want to know your name for a long time. Now, it's just floating. I'm like, oh my God, the fish is, whatever. I was so attached. I'm like, you didn't even name it, But it takes me a long time. And yet the child who I was going to adopt, I went and because I'd already taken a long time to attach to my own child, my biological child, I had it down with this kid. And then interestingly, when I had to talk to the mother, I was like, I'm going to give your child a good home. And I didn't want to go, I'm a really famous writer. And I said, I'm adopted myself. I thought that would help. And she basically gave it to the Catholic Youth Charities. And I was like, bye, Charlie. Yeah. So, and even my daughter and I talk about it all the time. She's like, you remember Charlie? I'm like, yes. I named him, not like a goldfish. But anyway, so I think it's all, good. I think in terms of, the one thing that is weird, having a biological relative now. I've never had one before, so we yell at each other. We're like, you're yelling at me, you're yelling at me. There is this mirroring thing that's very different. That's both a positive and a negative, honestly, because you're yelling at yourself, and it can get pretty intense. And I used to yell at my mother all the time, and she just looked at me like, what is the matter with you? She didn't yell back. She didn't do what, so it's different, But the other one little anecdote I'll tell you is, so I used to fight terribly with my mother, horribly. And then after I had my child, I called her, I'm really sorry. I just have to tell you, I'm really sorry. I owe you more than a big apology. I don't even know what I can do to make it up to you. And I used to, when we'd fight, she would say, I hope when you grow up you have a little girl just like you. And I would go, I hope I do. And then I called her one day, I'm like, Mom, she's doing this horrible thing. Well, she's like, just like me. My mom goes, no, you were worse. And so, it's a process. It is. And I think I don't think there's a right way or wrong way. I think there's just, turbulence is a word for a reason. It's, right.
That's a good motto. They should put that on all the tchotchkes they sell out there.
Exactly.
Turbulence is a word. I want to ask you one more question because I'm sure that the hometown audience...
I feel like I'm 9 with my shoe untied. Hold on.
I'll make it a long question so that you have time to tie. So you wrote that great book about L.A., nonfiction, kind of investigating the soul of L.A. and the weirdness, but the character of the city. Yeah. And we need you here for the hometown city.
Oh, my God.
Wouldn't it be great for you to do a book about D.C.?
Well, yeah. I mean, D.C. to me is the most fascinating, weirdest possible place ever. I mean, L.A. is like D.C. in some ways because it sort of is this strange kind of company-ish town, and people don't want to offend people because they're going to work for them tomorrow, and there's a delicate balance and all of those things. But D.C., I'm fascinated by it. I'm constantly reading about D.C. I'm trying to write a novel, and I'll just tell you this one thing, because before the election, I had this idea I've been working on for several years, and it's about the downfall of the U.S. government. Exactly. And I talked to the agents, the publisher, and they're like, it's like science fiction. You don't write science fiction. I was like, I know, but it's something's bothering me. Something's really bothering me. And then right after the election, they're like, ring, ring. When will you have the manuscript ready? And in the novel, which is not yet written but supposed to come out, basically the government implodes in 2020, which is also the 400th anniversary of Plymouth Rock. And so there's tons of all this crazy material and so much stuff I've been consuming, and I haven't had the time to write the damn book. And I feel like I have to hurry because then it's just going to be that already happened. But it is, yeah. And I love DC. I mean, it's such an interesting, wacky place.
Well, I want that book.
Me too. I'm
Yeah.
I promise I'm trying. I have a bunch of notes and I just have to get writing on it.
Well, A.M. Holmes, I've
Thank
read you for years. You are not like J.D. Salinger in terms of being a writer I admire and then don't want to meet. I'm really happy to have met you, and this is a wonderful
So I'm not
collection.
that weird. That's what people always say. You seem awfully nice in person. Yeah. No, thank you.
Thank you to both of you.
Are we gonna ask
Yeah. I'm actually going to start the questions, if that's okay.
Yes.
But please feel free to come up to the microphones. Mine has to do, again, with the title story.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Days of Awe,
Yes.
which made me go right to Yom Kippur.
Right. It's a good place to go.
So I would just talk about that.
Okay, so for a while, this book was actually called The Presence of Absence. And then there was a moment a little while ago, like last fall, we were like, what? And I thought, that's just not going to work. And I'd been working on this story that had just been called Yom Kippur, with no real title for about this. The title story took probably about 10 years to write. I had various versions of it, and there was all these things where I kept saying, and last summer I got to go to Oxford, England, and I was in somebody's house for a month by myself. And I kept saying, talk to yourself like you would one of your students. And I was like, what's wrong with the story? And I said, you're not taking enough risk. You're not doing it. And I was like, oh, fine, be that way. And then I fired myself several times. I'm like, you're out of here. I'm going to bring in another writer to finish this thing. But the notion, the notion of Days of Awe, and also why I liked it actually as a book title, but I actually had to I went to 2 rabbis and said, can I call the book Days of Awe? And I sent them the story, and they go, there's a lot of sex in the story. And I go, I know. And they go, but that's okay. They go, that's a good Sabbath thing. You're supposed to have sex on the Sabbath. I'm like, okay. I'm like, TMI from a rabbi. But Days of Awe is the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And it's a very important time when you're sort of asking to be rewritten in the book of life, and you're also sort of making amends. And in Judaism, one of the cool things that I love is you're supposed to apologize for things that you haven't even done, things that you might maybe have thought of, and you might not. And for a fiction writer, I can just apologize like for 1,000 years. I'm like, I had that weird thought, I saw that weird picture in my head. So that was interesting to me, but I also feel like we're living, awe is a fascinating word because it's not just, oh, that's so cool. It's like, oh, and I think that's what we're living in. It's sort of somewhere between sublime and apocalyptic. And so that was of interest to me, both philosophically and kind of spiritually and in relation to history and all that. I don't know if that's answering your question, but that was, yeah.
It is ironic.
Yeah.
That part of what's happening, last apology of any or atonement.
Right. Or redemption, or any of the things, right, any of the classics. Yeah. But I think that's also one of the things that I have been trying to write about over the last probably 5 or 10 years is the notion of what happens when you forget your history. And May We Be Forgiven has that with the Nixon professor who gets fired because history is becoming more future forward, which is kind of the moment we're at now, because we're not acting in relation to our own history as a country. So there's a lot of worrisome stuff happening. But that was the Days of Awe thing. Does anyone else have a question? Sarah Wattenberg? Sarah and I were children. We worked for Humphrey Campaign Jr., and we used to sit in Sarah's basement and paint Humphrey HHH ashtrays, and they go door to door selling them. We got a thank you note. Yeah, sure.
Just because we're recording.
The first one is, do you remember Miss Boyagi?
Of course.
Of course.
Yes,
I knew you
of
were going
course.
to say of course.
And I'm Facebook friends with her sister.
Oh, really?
Yeah, who my brother knew, Mindy Moak. That's her, right, John? Where's John? Yeah, right, that was her sister. Miss Boyagi was our 8th grade English teacher.
Right.
And then when I dropped out of 10th grade and had to make up some time, like prison sentence, I went back to 8th grade and graded papers for 2 hours a day.
Okay,
Just
I didn't
saying,
know that.
there's a way through everything.
I didn't know that.
I know.
So here's my question. One of my memories of you, I have a couple of interesting memories of you, but this one was, I'm always very curious about sort of like how I ended up in my own job. Like, how did I get here, right? And I think that you always knew you were going to be a writer, more or less?
I wanted to be in the Rolling Stones. That was the whole thing. And there was just no vacancies and no girls.
Plan B?
My mom will tell
Plan
you,
B?
all I did was Plan B.
Okay, Plan B.
And I also wanted to be a doctor. I used to go to the National Medical Library every night and read. I would drive my mother's
Wow,
65
that's
Pontiac Tempest up to the National Medical Library, Park Badley. And you had to request books, and that took forever. But they also stayed open really late. I was a really dangerous teenager looking at rashes.
So here's my question.
Yes.
So one of the things I was very impressed by was we were on the bus one morning, and I don't know why, because I don't think we took the same bus, but anyway. And you gave me this very large manuscript, and you had been writing an autobiography of yourself in Miss Boyagi's class.
Really?
And you gave it to me and said, I'd love to know what you think.
That's so funny.
To which I said, huh? So in my constant sort of search for figuring out how did I get where I am,
Right.
do you ever look back on particular moments And I mean, that is a really interesting thing, I thought, even at the time, for a kid of your age to really have a full manuscript. I mean,
wish I had that manuscript.
Are there moments where you look back as sort of touchstones and see that's who you were going to be?
I wish it was like that. I mean, I think that I really was the other side of it is I was such an anxious and shy and just struggling kid. I mean, I was thinking you were going to say, like, I remember in 8th grade when you wore your winter coat all year so no one would see if your butt was fat. And I was like, it's just so that, because that would have to be not self-conscious to wear like a giant parka with the fur-trimmed hood thing from Sears all year. I was really incognito. No, I think for me in terms of writing, I wish I really could remember what that thing I had written was.
I kept it for years, you can imagine.
I think I was trying always to sort of get out of my life here, not out of Washington, but just out of what felt like not my right life. And I always thought, I'm going to go to New York. And I always felt like an outsider a little bit in Washington and like somehow edgier, darker than. And then as soon as I got to New York, I really felt like I'm a Republican. I'm sorry, I'm a Republican, because there were so many weird things happening. I was like, that is so weird. So I don't know, but I think in terms of writing, I really wanted to do something kind of loud and large in the world, which my mother and brother will tell you I was loud and large, and that drove them crazy. So I don't know, and writing was just the way you could do it, kind of, for lack of a word, privately as a secretly shy person. You could make things and then throw them out there and run and hide, You're a therapist now, Sarah. Right?
Trained as a therapist who ended up, don't kill me, working in the White House when Trump came in.
Oh my God, we have to talk later.
Yeah.
We can all go.
So it was sort of an interesting experience.
Right. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, sit down now, Sarah. Anyone else have a question? Somebody asked whenever my mother will, which is always worrisome.
Can you talk about your sense of humor? I recognize it. I grew up with it. It formed my life, and I wonder where the hell you got it from.
That's very funny. My sense of humor. I grew up, my parents used to take me all the time to Arena Stage because I also couldn't bear to stay home by myself. So I had to go to the theater whenever. I had to go to everything they went to, which was really, again, horrible for them. Turned out to be great for me. So I had what I always describe as invisible mentors. Edward Albee, who actually became a real mentor in my real life. Harold Pinter, mostly playwrights, Carol Churchill. So I think my sense of humor, comes in part from that, and a strong sense of just the absurd. And also, importantly, I firmly believe, I feel like this book is in a way a lot more serious in some ways than other things I've written. But I also feel like if you're going to be serious, you have to kind of break the surface, literally, by making people laugh at various points, because it allows you to then open things up and get in a little bit more deeply. Yeah.
You've got those quick one-liners in a lot of the stories, and then they head somewhere else.
Yeah.
But I love what you said. Well, I read it in this handout that came with
did they
my
give you?
my critic's
They
copy.
didn't send me the handout.
Oh, well, you can have it.
That's okay.
But where whoever was asking you the questions asked something about what you thought the difference was in writing short stories and novels.
Yeah.
And you said you tell your students that with
Like the train?
the train.
Yeah, so I always think, novel, okay. So I describe it as a short story is like taking the train cross country, but you get on in Chicago, which my mother and I took the train from on book tour when I didn't want to fly, from New York all the way around, actually Washington, all the way around the entire country and back in 15 days. We had to skip certain cities. I'm like, I'm sorry, it doesn't fit the train schedule. We can't stop. But there is a compression to a short story. So something's already happened by the time you get there. And a novel has the luxury of unfolding, and it has that sense of it's a wander. And in the last book, May We Be Forgiven, I purposely took these real digressions where you sort of literally wander off. And that was both great fun, but you can't do that in a story. Stories are much more kind of sculptural and built. They have definition to them.
And that's what I think of in terms of the humor question.
Yeah.
You've got the quick one-liners, but you can't do those big sort of digressions about Nixon
Right,
studies,
right.
which was terrific.
Right, and there was a point where I was writing these Nixon short stories, and they're in, some fragments of it are in May We Be Forgiven. I thought at a certain point that you're actually going to write a whole book of Nixon stories, and you best just stop now. But I went to the Nixon library, and there's just such incredible ephemera and documents, and then I also realized I bought the snow globe, and I got it home, and I realized that is so weird because it's Yorba Linda, and it doesn't snow there, but in the snow globe of the Nixon Library, it does. And I thought, again, that like sums it up for me. That's America in a nutshell, you know?
And on that
I know, exactly. Thank you guys so much, and really, thank you.